Hi, everybody. I realize that I told you we were going to go over this FRQ practice, and then I take off for the day. So you're probably going to be confused if we don't at least sort of address um, the FRQ practice. So you're going to write the argument essay today, and you'll be writing it individually. But if you remember last class, I kind of told you to like work with a group, come up with a thesis, think about how you could use this evidence to support your thesis. And some of you even started to do an outline. If you did, you're ahead of the game. But if you didn't, well, hopefully this will help you. So you can see here the essay that you're going to get from Mr. Dwyer is going to look very similar to this. The prompt will look very similar to this, um, where it's going to ask you to develop an argument, and then you're going to have to articulate a defensible claim or thesis. You're going to have to support your claim with at least two pieces of accurate and relevant information. And everybody remember, one piece has to come from the list of three. I'm going to be generous, and Mr. Dwyer is going to give you the three that you could do a little research on and write that research down on a index card that you can take and use on the FRQ. I'm so nice, my goodness. And then you need to use a second piece of evidence that either comes from this list or from something outside that you know about the topic. So just keep that in mind. Then you have to use reasoning and be very clear about how the evidence that you have chosen supports your thesis. And then be sure to include a counterclaim and then either refute or rebut that counterclaim. Okay? So I just want to really emphasize to you how easy the thesis portion can be. Don't overthink it. I know I keep telling students that this is not English class. So just make sure that when you articulate your defensible claim or thesis that you use the wording of the prompt. So for example here, this prompt asks you to develop an argument that explains whether the government of the United States is fundamentally responsive or fundamentally unresponsive to social movements' demands for public policy changes. Okay, so what I would want to see in your essay is you are going to talk about the US government, and you're going to talk about it being either fundamentally responsive or unresponsive to social movements' demands. I've seen with this prompt before that people will say that the government is responsive and they don't say what it's responsive to, and then you're not going to get the thesis. You're not addressing the prompt. So, literally, everybody, you could write the thesis that said the government of the United States is fundamentally responsive to social movements' demands for public policy changes, right? So, you could write government of the United States, hopefully you would capitalize it, is fundamentally responsive to the demands for change coming from social movements. Does that establish an argument? Does that establish a thesis that you can actually use evidence to support? Absolutely. You do not have to overthink this. I really can't emphasize that enough. So, and here's where the argument essay gets difficult is you have to remember what these foundational documents say or mean, right? In this case, you're looking at Brutus 1, Federalist 10, or the US Constitution. If I was saying that it's fundamentally responsive, right? Fundamentally responsive, I might think about the US Constitution, and in particular, Article 5 of the US Constitution, which is provisions for amendment, right? And Article 5 effectively says, hey, the founding fathers knew that our government might need to be changed. And they are going to create a way for the very text of our original government to be changed if Congress, right, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states agree that it's necessary. And then it says you can use a second piece of evidence from another foundational document. So you could think about how Federalist 10, when it discusses factions, or Brutus 1, which is an anti-federalist document, which would argue kind of against, right, the government being responsive. Um, so maybe those two don't represent great options. So what might you choose? Well, think about all of the things we've covered that have shown how the government has responded to social movements. Just off the top of my head, you could choose things like Brown versus Board, right? Um, Obergefell, right? The Hodges, okay? Or you could even do, and probably the best one, is just simply the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, right? And these are things that have come up that have shown ways in which the government has responded to the social movements, right? Their calls for change. Brown versus Board, of course, ending segregation. Obergefell, legalizing same-sex marriage. Civil Rights Act, like responding directly to the push for civil rights activists to get rid of Jim Crow in the South, right? So those all work. And again, you only choose one, and you have to very clearly explain how they support your thesis that the government is fundamentally responsive. And I can't emphasize this enough. Do not assume your grader knows anything. Okay? Really hold their hand through the explanation. And then after that, do your counterclaim. Your counterclaim doesn't have to include a piece of evidence. Okay? It helps if it does, right? But feel free to use a counterclaim. You know how to do this. State something like, although many people think that I don't know, that the amendment process is too difficult, right? There are other ways in which you can address that the US government has addressed social movements' calls for change, right? You all know how to do this. You have to give that example of how they've done that. And once you're done, you're done. So people do this in 3, 4 paragraphs, 5 if you're going crazy. But remember, on the AP test, this is supposed to be done in 40 minutes. So I think in third period, I gave them about 50 to 60 minutes, but try, if you can, keep track of your time, see if you can get it done in 40. Okay? Um, so after this, Mr. Dwyer is going to give you the 3 documents that you will need. And again, do some research on them, write them on the index card, and then he'll pass out the exam prompt and have a good time. After you're done, I think there'll be some time for test corrections. Mr. Dwyer has the Scantrons at the back, and you can get a test and you can work on those. So I miss you, and I will see you all next week. Okay.